All right, welcome. My name is Ryan, and welcome back to another Curve Breaker workshop. For those of you that is your first time joining us, a Curve Breaker workshop is where we allow clinicians to come and speak to us on a certain topic and how they specialize in that and how they use it in the Thriveworks realm with their clients and how we can better help clinicians do that. We call these presenters clinical gurus. And today I have Valerie Green out of our Chesapeake office. I've known Valerie for, I don't know, a little over a year and a half probably now. And I'm very excited for her to speak about a topic that is very relevant right now. On behalf of Thriveworks, I can tell you that we have just been very heartbroken from the racism that's been on display in the nation. Racism has been something that has been a part of this country since it was born, and the last couple months it's been very prevalent, and with most recently obviously George Floyd and his death and the response that it has brought from our nation in some areas has just mortified us, and we just can't sit back. Thriveworks not only takes a stand against racism and any form of discrimination, but we've also decided to take action for our clinicians and for our clients to be better. And so, as you know, we have been gathering some videos from our clinicians of questions that are being sought from our clients, and what better way to have Thriveworks clinicians be able to support them. We also have this Curve Breaker workshop that, I think first, Valerie, you presented this to our CCO, Heidi Faust, about a year ago. And then at the beginning of this year, about 3 months ago, probably, I reached out to you and said, hey, I think it's time. What are your thoughts? And we decided to have it presented on this date. And it has just happened to be extremely relevant right now. And then the last thing that we have in the pipeline is we are going to be implementing safe spaces for our Thriveworks clinicians. And for those of you not familiar with a safe space is a place where our clinician will be able to feel have no chance of being discriminated against or harassed or being caused any emotional harm. And also to not be viewed as weak or incompetent when it comes to their job as a clinician for Thriveworks. And it will allow us to hear and to support and to be better. And just to debrief with our clinicians and find out what we need to do to take more action in supporting them, and then obviously we're supporting our clients. And so if you have any questions about any of the things that I just mentioned, or suggestions on how we can continue to take action, I would love to hear from you. And you can email me on my personal email, ryanc@thriveworks.com. And I would love to chat to you about that. Now, going back to today, we have, like I said, Valerie Green, and she has a ton of experience talking about multicultural issues and through keynote speaking and being a professor at several different colleges, leading semesters on multicultural studies and counseling. And so I am very excited for this presentation. And, just to kind of go over a little bit of how it works, she's going to present to us for the next 30 minutes or first half, whatever you want to call it. And you can think of questions for her, because at the last half is going to be question and answer. And so if you see at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button. You can click that, and it will allow you to type in your questions to me, and then I'll be able to ask them to Valerie, and then she'll be able to address them. And so I'm gonna hand it over to you, Valerie, because we're definitely here to listen to you, not me. So take it from here.
Okay, thanks so much, Ryan. I am excited to be doing this presentation and absolutely having mixed emotions like everyone else about the content. As Ryan said, I have been doing this work for a long time. So I'm excited that people are talking about it, and heartbroken and all kinds of a mixed bag of emotions about where we are as a country. But first and foremost, I'm hopeful. I am hopeful. So just to give you a quick background of who I am, I have been doing clinical practice for over 25 years, which I can't believe. For 9 years, I taught a course at Simmons University School for Social Work called Multicultural Clinical Practice. That dealt with issues of race, culture, gender, sexual orientation, and classism. I have extensive experience with PTSD, and most specifically domestic dating violence and sexual assault. I've consulted on numerous cases over the years where trauma was overlooked and the symptoms or presenting problems were the sole focus of the assessment and diagnosis, which they should be, but trauma was not considered. And we'll go more into that as I move through the presentation. Lastly, treatment began and a therapeutic alliance was built many times. I'm sure you've experienced this. At this point, trauma came out or was missed altogether due to the clinician's perspective of the client's narrative. And that's where our bias comes in. And that's what we're going to look at a little further. And I want to emphasize that this is just a beginning. This is obviously something we can't address in one curve breaker. So this is just a beginning, and I'm really proud that Thriveworks is taking a lead on this and committing to make this an ongoing commitment to address these issues. Purpose and objectives: to gain a clear understanding of the meaning of and distinction between the terms culture, race, and ethnicity. We want to start with that so that everybody's on the same page and speaking the same language. Explore the role culture plays in our own lives and shapes our worldview and functioning. That is the lens through which we see our clients and assess and treat our clients. Make the connection between culture and presenting problems and how we assess our clients. Learn how to avoid premature diagnosis and assessment without exploring cultural context through the client's narrative. That's a biggie. Treatment approach: expanding on the trauma-informed approach. There's been a lot of training and emphasis on trauma-informed work lately in our field, which is excellent. But more recently, clinicians are talking about including cultural systemic barriers or a social justice approach when we look through the lens of our trauma-informed approach. Terminology. So when we talk about ethnicity, that's the most specific of the three terms. We're talking about our ancestry, our country of origin. Individuals usually possess more than one ethnicity. They may choose to identify more with one than the other based upon that side of the family that they're closer to or know more about, or sometimes, depending on the circumstances, they may choose to identify with an ethnicity that's more welcomed and more accepted, more appreciated. For example, if someone is Irish and Italian and they live in an Italian neighborhood, they're probably going to say they're Italian. They're probably going to identify with the Italian ethnicity. In the context of where we are as a country right now, when we're talking about African Americans, even though we are often referred to as an ethnic group, we don't really know our ethnicity for the most part. Barring doing the DNA testing, ancestry.com, what have you, Most of us don't know our ethnicity, which is ironic in that this term is typically tied to us. But ethnicity is very specific. Race is a social construct. It's based upon physical appearance and characteristics, becoming increasingly complex as more people are descendants of multiple ethnicities. Race was a form of categorizing people. And we can get more into that as we talk more about this in the presentation. Lastly, culture. Culture is the broadest of the three terms. Shared values, beliefs, worldview, experiences, language, religion, child rearing practices, gender roles and gender role expectations, customs and rituals. Shared history can simply be culture. And coping styles. Sometimes what begins as a coping style through the generations can become something that is identified as part of culture. And sometimes these coping styles are healthy, sometimes they're unhealthy, and sometimes they become less and less relevant, but we may justify them or stay stuck in them because, oh, that's our culture. So sometimes while we want to accept it and value and respect that, sometimes we want to help and challenge what may be a cultural coping style that may not work anymore or may not be relevant. This is a diagram that I came up with years and years ago just to give a visual. People can belong to more than one ethnicity, yet belong to the same race. People of several different races can belong to the same culture. For example, our profession as mental health clinicians, we have a culture. Many of my clients are military. The military has a culture. Thriveworks has its own culture. So culture can be not just related to race, religion, or ethnicity, but it can be just in the context of a group that you belong to. Explore your own experiences. This is where we really want to be self-reflective. If you think about your favorite grandparent or grandparent figure, you want to think about lessons, values, or traditions that they passed on to you. When you think about your own ethnicity, race, and culture, answer the following questions. What is my identity in terms of my family, my community, and who we are in the world? What are some systemic limitations or privileges that are present? What are our strengths and challenges as a culture? What are we proud of? What do we celebrate? As we do this own reflection on our own identity, it helps us better understand our clients. What do we grieve as a culture? In what ways are we vulnerable? Based upon your history, based upon the current circumstances, based upon what's been passed down to you. What coping styles have become a way of life through this context? Again, healthy or unhealthy? Your culture, your narrative. For those of us who come from the social work perspective, this is a visual of the systemic life model perspective in social work theory. Just like our clients, we are layered as far as our identity and in cultural context. We have ourselves and what we bring as an individual. The next layer would be our family. What did we learn? What was instilled in us? What experiences did we have? Our school environment. What did we learn? What was valued? What was the culture? What was challenging? What were strengths? Within the community where we lived or grew up, or the community where we currently live, what is valued? What are challenges? What are strengths? In what ways are we vulnerable? In what ways are we privileged? Nationally, within our identity, how are we viewed and what is our experience? This ties directly into the experience of African Americans right now. Nationally, we are having to see more clearly than ever before what the African American experience is. This is not new for us, but the country is waking up in a way that it hasn't before. So therefore, our culture is shifting now. And even globally, there's a new perspective on who African Americans are and what they experience. However, this model was designed to apply to any of us. I'm just tying that in, excuse me, based upon what's happening in the world right now. Client culture, client narrative. When we first meet our clients and we do that assessment, that psychosocial assessment, biopsychosocial assessment, we first get the identifying information. But what we want to do in that family history is dig a little deeper. We want to have discussions and explore the client's religion, their values, gender roles, child rearing practices. Of course, this usually doesn't happen in the first session. This unfolds over time. But as we get that family history and as we get to know our client better, we are getting their cultural narrative. And that helps us understand their context, what they may be vulnerable to in the world. Community and environmental strengths and challenges. Strengths may be privileges, or strengths may just be something that is a resource that is well utilized, an internal resource. What, if any, vulnerable populations would the client belong to? Through class, is the client living in poverty? Race, are they a person of color who experiences racism? Gender, are they experiencing sexism or misogyny or harassment? Sexual orientation, homophobia. Religion, anti-Semitism, xenophobia. As we listen for all of this, this is their narrative. We get to learn about trauma through the client's narrative, because often they don't come right out and tell us they've experienced trauma. So we can't always rely on the client to come right out and tell us about their trauma history. They may not consider it to be a trauma. And I'll get a little more into that. Trauma and cultural context. Here at Thriveworks, when we meet with our client for the intake visit, our assessment through the template that we use does specifically ask if the client has a trauma history. But many times, as I said a minute ago, the client will say no, or sometimes they'll even say they're not sure. As we get to know the client, develop the therapeutic alliance, and they begin to trust us more of that narrative comes out. How often can we say that we discover that there, in fact, has been a trauma history? Maybe the third or fourth session in, maybe longer. And the client comes from a background where it may have been normalized. Too often, this is due to cultural context or even our own biases, which are based upon what we may consciously or unconsciously normalize as well. Examples may be verbal or physical abuse, abandonment, community or war violence, extreme poverty, multiple losses to violence, extreme bullying, sometimes through the lens of our own bias, and again, through the way the client identifies themselves. The trauma from which they come has been normalized. So as we do that assessment, as we make that diagnosis, do the treatment plan, do our interventions, trauma may be nowhere on the radar screen because we haven't considered it based upon the way we may categorize a certain group, or even the way that client may view him or herself. Misdiagnosing or overlooking trauma. When we ignore cultural context, we run the risk of prematurely pathologizing or misdiagnosing our clients. There's several research studies out about the frequency with which clients of color are often given major mental illness diagnoses, those Axis 1 diagnoses, which may be accurate, but trauma hasn't even been considered. Oftentimes, there is trauma instead of that diagnosis or trauma in conjunction with that diagnosis. And that's been something that has sort of been a plight or a banner of mine from right out of training. Whenever I have an opportunity to sit on a multidisciplinary and multicultural team, I'm always listening for trauma when it may be overlooked. And I hope that if you get nothing else out of this curve breaker, that whenever you sit with a client who looks different from you or who is different from you, please always consider and listen for trauma. Assessment and diagnosis based solely on symptoms negates environmental circumstances and or systemic oppression, which is likely a part of the sociocultural narrative and trauma of our clients. This is just emphasizing what we've already been talking about. When we only look at the client based upon what they present before us, that mental status exam, the presenting symptoms, the acute symptoms, and we don't dig a little deeper and listen for or explore for their reality, their community, their family history, their challenges and experiences, what are they vulnerable to in the world? We've completely missed the boat on systemic oppression and or environmental circumstances, which may have been traumatic and directly related to the presenting symptoms. The other thing that I've found is helpful for clients and in building the alliance with the clients is naming the trauma. When that client comes in, we do the intake, we meet 3 or 4 times, and all of a sudden they may disclose that they've lost several friends to gun violence. They may disclose that there was extreme or severe poverty, or they had an incarcerated parent from the time maybe that they were a toddler. When we name that experience as trauma, we are dignifying and validating that client as not being deserving of that experience that they had. I'm going to read that. When we hear trauma in our clients' narratives, it is critical to name it as such. This validates that you see them as a person undeserving of the trauma. It negates victim blaming, which we have historically been guilty of in this country, from women to people of color, to people of the LGBT community, to immigrants. We could go on and on. Victim blaming is an ugly part of our culture that we are changing now. And it acknowledges the social injustices and the systems in the context where these traumas have occurred. I love this diagram that I ran across on social media one day, and I just kind of did a screenshot of it. Think about how many times children of color are diagnosed with ADHD. And here is a visual overlap of trauma and ADD. I'm just going to go over the overlapping features. Difficulty concentrating and learning, easily distracted, often doesn't seem to listen, disorganized, hyperactive, restless, difficulty sleeping. Children are judged based upon a set of standards with an assumption that everybody had a good night's sleep, everybody had a good breakfast, everybody had two parents in the home, there was no violence, etc. When all of that is not in place, this is what these kids look like in the classroom. And rather than considering domestic violence, child abuse, a substance abuser in the home, extreme poverty, we slap that ADHD diagnosis on that kid and medicate them, when trauma may in fact have been the issue. So this is really powerful. Trauma-informed approach and its limitations. Now, I want to emphasize, I am not bashing the trauma-informed approach at all. I am completely sold, hook, line, and sinker on the trauma-informed approach. This is just a way of looking at expanding and adding to the trauma-informed approach. In therapy, the trauma-informed approach includes and recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients, family, staff, and others involved with the system. Responds by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices, and seeks to actively resist re-traumatizing. Ryan referred to this earlier when he talked about safe spaces. So this is really important. Trauma-informed approach is super important. While trauma-informed therapy is important, social justice-informed therapy is even more important. One cannot fully practice trauma-informed therapy without understanding the trauma of social justice. That is a quote from Maria Paradis. When we only look at trauma without considering the context in which it happened, again, we run the risk of the client not even realizing or seeing the fact that they've experienced trauma, but in many ways, we could be colluding with the systems. When internalized societal perceptions and traumatic experiences impede the client's mental health through daily oppression, the therapist can and should present an analysis that increases the client's perception of how the two are linked. This is based upon a presentation by a woman last name Espen that she did at a conference of the American Psychological Association in 2006. She also says our client's mental health is dependent on our incorporation of a deep understanding and integration of the impact of social, historical, cultural circumstances on individual lives. I think that statement is so powerful. That's why I lifted it from her talk. To do less than this compromises our professional and ethical responsibilities. I'm so encouraged by that quote and so encouraged by the direction in which we are moving as a country and as a profession, where we are incorporating the importance of considering social justice as an ethical necessity in our practice. Cultural context and trauma. This is a visual, and you may or may not be able to see the verbiage, but again, I think that it's a nice visual to look at how intergenerational trauma can translate into culture. If we're looking at the first column, the individual's name is Jane, and her lineage is from that of her great-great-grandparents surviving European wars. From that, there's PTSD. Down the generations, coping style becomes drinking, and we get alcoholism. From alcoholism and substance abuse, distorted boundaries, poor judgment, sexual abuse has evolved from the alcoholism. Emotional depression as a result of that trauma, and all of this is passed down through the generations. The next individual is a descendant of great-great-grandparents surviving slavery, racial violence in the American South. This includes abandonment from the history of families being sold off and separated. Many times internalized racism and oppression and child rearing practices have resulted in child abuse and domestic violence. From that domestic violence comes low self-esteem. Down through the generations comes complex PTSD. The last example, this person is a descendant of surviving great-great-grandparents of famine and oppression in British India. Severe poverty. That verbiage is so small, I can't even read it, but you get the point. Some type of systemic issue that was traumatic comes down and translates to severe anxiety and depression. And this not only gets translated as psychological diagnostic issues, but we know from The Body Keeps the Score that it changes DNA, it changes our cells, it changes our neurology, and we're just beginning to learn about the ways in which trauma and intergenerational trauma affects us physiologically. That leads to, for example, in the African American community, many of us know that we are epidemic in hypertension and diabetes and heart disease. But if you think about stress, generations of trauma, it would make sense that we would have these medical issues. Overview and treatment approaches using the trauma and social justice informed approach. So this is combining the two. Remember what the term culture means. Again, that's shared values, worldview, experiences, privilege and or oppression, religion, language, child rearing practices, gender roles, etc. Explore and become aware of your own culture and be open to facing your own biases. This, again, is where we are now. We've got to be open, and that's a hard thing to do. Change is difficult. We're having to face what we haven't faced in 400 plus years. Being open will allow us to be better clinicians and better humans. Ask and listen for cultural context in the client's narrative. Again, some of it, even when you ask directly, they may not know how to answer, but as you listen to their story, listen to their narrative, their experiences, that cultural context will come out. This should be done through that multi-layered conceptualization. You're listening for those layers in which that client exists. As you hear trauma being normalized in the client's history, please name it as such, call it trauma. That validates the client and validates their experience. Again, as I just said, we're validating the experience as one that is not deserved and not the client's fault. Make sure they feel emotionally and physically safe as they enter and as they leave the session. Monitor and contain acute symptoms before any extensive exploratory work to avoid re-traumatizing. So much of our trauma work is about just containing those symptoms and decreasing the symptoms. You don't want to dig deeper and peel back layers when the client is having acute symptoms. Once the client is not having acute symptoms and feels safe, then we can begin the trauma and social justice informed approach. This includes, again, validating the trauma, as well as the systems of historical and present forms of oppression our clients often have to endure. I know that was quick. That was a condensed version of a lot of information that can be expanded upon and discussed and pulled back and stretched even further, but I hope that this is just a beginning of learning, exchanging ideas, discussing cases, and I hope that we can do more of this. Thank you. I'm sorry. Before we go to questions, let me go to the suggested reading. And I just want to go over this really quick. again, when this presentation was first done and conceptualized, it was to be broad. It was not specific to the African American population, even though that's what we've been focusing on lately and need to focus on. This presentation was broad. So this suggested reading list looks at several different groups. I'm sure that Ryan will make this available. I like to give fiction when I give suggested reading. There's a lot of nonfiction out in the best-selling lists and that are flying off the shelves now for how to be anti-racist and how to be more socially conscious and understand the African American experience. But some of these books on this suggested reading list are novels. They're reality-based fiction. And again, as you can tell, I'm into narratives. And a lot of these works really help get into the experience of trauma of these characters, from the perspective of their narrative. A Chance in the World by Steve Pemberton is an amazing memoir of a biracial child in the foster care system in the early 1970s. Mona in the Promised Land is a Japanese girl who is growing up in predominantly white and Jewish New York. I'll skip down. Caucasia, again, is about a biracial girl who has a sister. One is born looking Caucasian, one is born looking African American, and a lot of dynamics play out there. When I Was Puerto Rican is about a young Puerto Rican girl coming of age as her family deals with the dual identity of being American citizens, yet being Puerto Rican, and all the oppressive racism that goes along with that. Nickel and Dimed in America is about social class. And lastly, if you have streaming, which most of us do, I encourage you to watch The Hate U Give, Just Mercy, and for gender role issues and misogyny, oppression of women, I encourage you to watch Unorthodox. I hope I didn't go too far with the time, but I did want to highlight that suggested reading.
Oh, excellent.
Thank you.
Definitely. Well, we definitely have some questions that have come in.
Okay.
And so our first question says, I have a client who has asked how to acknowledge the current climate with African American people in her life. She does not want to ignore the cultural context and current events, but has found herself feeling awkward around African American acquaintances and not knowing what to say. Can you give any guidance on this?
Yeah, this is the question du jour. White community feeling like they want to do better, but not knowing how and not knowing where to start. And I think the best way to dignify this and show your sincerity and authenticity is to acknowledge just that. I don't know what to say. Showing that you're open, showing that you care, not trivializing or trying to nice it away. I actually listened to an excellent podcast just yesterday that I would suggest for any of you. Brene Brown, who I hope we all know about, did a podcast with an African American author and friend of hers, and they talked about how we can dialogue with those that are already in our lives that are different from ourselves. I think the best thing that the white community can do is self-educate, read, ask questions, listen. It's not about, oh my gosh, I don't know what to say. It's more about listening and being open and exploring ways in which you may have been oblivious to your own privilege and ways in which you may have taken it for granted. The example a lot of people use is Asking somebody to explain or understand white privilege is like asking a fish to explain water. So if that can give you a good analogy, your reality has been something that you've been oblivious to, which is a privilege in and of itself. So I'm not sure that I gave a clear answer, but be open, educate yourself, and acknowledge that you don't know what to say.
Next question says, when working with kids and finding out what you talked about, maybe trauma was misdiagnosed as ADHD or just misdiagnosed as something else, what would be the next steps there, say in the school platform, or just, in working with them at Thriveworks, what would be your steps in trying to inform maybe other wraparound services that they have?
Yeah, if you're not already doing so, I would meet with the parents and explore trauma and let the clients know that you really want to consider what else has been going on with this child that may or may not be indicative of ADHD. And it has to be said that it can be both. It is possible to have ADHD as well as a trauma history, but if it is both, you want to address both. So I would meet with the parents or whoever the child's primary caregiver is and find out if there is trauma historically or going on in the child's life, and that would have to be treated and addressed as well. More importantly, if you think it's a full-blown misdiagnosis, if you think this child doesn't have ADHD, this child is a trauma survivor, then it's time to invite people for a team meeting or suggest a team meeting and why you don't believe that this child has ADHD and that it is trauma. It's a time to advocate for that whole family, actually.
All right. How should the therapist bring these topics into the therapy room with their clients that come from different backgrounds?
I think it's important to remember that it is their therapy hour, and you want to make sure the client is comfortable raising any issue, but we want to make sure we don't push our own agenda. Remember what we learned in our training and what we learned in supervision, that while it may be in the forefront of our mind, that client may be coming in for their marital conflict that they've been dealing with since they started meeting with you. And yes, all this crazy stuff is happening in the world, but that hour with you or that 50 minutes with you, they're still wanting to work on their marriage or their anxiety. So I think you want to be open and leave room for those issues to be addressed. Make sure that you're not putting up a wall, but remember, it's that client's hour, and maybe that's not how they want to use it.
Yeah. Any suggestions for readings or training specifically about the intersection of counseling and social justice?
Yes, a lot of, maybe not specifically counseling and social justice, but if you look on Amazon right now, all you have to do is look at their bestsellers for the past 30 days. And there are some amazing titles that are just broad and good for anybody to begin to look at these issues. There are some academic, scholarly books about social justice and the counseling relationship that are useful, but I would start with the general books that are good for everybody, because that's where we're getting more narratives and more, I should say less academic information. I think we really want to be more self-reflective right now. White fragility is one. There's another one that is called How to Talk About Racism. Another one, How to Be an Anti-Racist. But again, Amazon is your best friend right now. They're doing a great job of promoting these titles.
Awesome. Okay, are there any guidelines or suggestions for the role of self-disclosure with clients? And do you have suggestions for clinicians who may need support with their own cultural / anti-racism growth?
Okay, let's do the first part. Can you repeat the
Yep,
first part?
first part. Are there any guidelines or suggestions for the role of self-disclosure with clients?
Okay. Well, yes. Again, we have to remember our training. I think people get anxious when we think about the history and the ugliness of racism. Much of our training that we had in graduate school still applies. You self-disclose when it will benefit the client, when it is not your agenda, when it is not to benefit you. If self-disclosing is going to affirm, validate, educate the client, then we briefly do that. Again, we want to remember that this relationship is for the benefit of the client. So let's remember that. And second part of the question?
Yeah, second part is, and do you have any suggestions for clinicians who may need support with their own cultural / anti-racism growth?
Oh, wow. Reading, watching movies. Again, I'm a big Amazon fan. Amazon Prime has a whole featured list of Black Lives Matter titles of movies and documentaries. Um, you may not like all of them. I don't like all of them. So you pick and choose, but they are opening up titles where you can see narratives and understand. I think getting a historical context is the best thing we can do in terms of looking at our own biases, your own therapy, your own supervision, case consultation with clinicians that have an expertise in this area. So I would suggest therapy, supervision, reading, and the arts, and learning history.
Awesome. Okay, I have several clients who have not addressed in session the changes the country is going through. Should clients be asked specifically about how they're feeling about this? I do not want to suggest that they should be struggling, but I also do not want to ignore a topic that someone might be hesitant to approach.
Interesting. I would question what is the racial dynamic or racial makeup of the clinician client, which might inform why or why not that may or may not be brought up. For example, as an African American therapist who has many white clients, some of them bring it up and some of them don't. For the ones that don't bring it up, I leave it at that because it's their hour. The power dynamic, however, is very different. If the therapist is white and the client is of color, as an African American, of course, I haven't had that experience. What I would suggest is opening it up and possibly saying, I know we've been talking about X or Y issues, but I just want to make sure that you know this is a safe space to talk about what's been happening in the world. And I hope that you feel comfortable bringing those issues up in our sessions because I do want to support you in that. Something like that in some language that feels natural to you. frankly, I think that's important for white clinicians to do with their clients of color. Let it still be their agenda as far as how they want to use the session, but do open up the invitation. I know we've been working on relaxation techniques, or I know we've been working on marital conflict or grief, but I want you to know this is a safe space. And I hope that you feel comfortable bringing up what's been happening in the world here. And I would leave it at that.
Excellent. How do you suggest Black clinicians address white clients who inherit or exhibit inherent bias towards the providers of color?
I would have to wonder why they're still in the therapeutic relationship. I would have to believe that the client is getting something if they're returning, if it's an ongoing relationship. If it's the beginning of the relationship, you might want to consider if it's a good fit. It may just not be a good fit. Some people are not ready to look at their biases, their own racism, and that doesn't mean they don't get to have therapy. Maybe they just don't need to have therapy with you or with me. It's not up to us to decide whether or not somebody can have therapy, but if they have implicit or blatant bias towards people of color and they're not open to looking at it, I don't know why they would even go to a therapist of color. One of the things that concerns me is when we get our training and, we're supposed to be this blank slate, we're supposed to be nurturing and open and sort of have this neutral stance. I worry sometimes about clinicians feeling triggered or abused by clients. I belong to several groups on social media of clinicians of color, and some of them have talked about clients who use abusive language or racial slurs and have been challenged with how to deal with it. And, I would just simply say that an outside referral would be indicated that, this just isn't a good fit. No clinician should have to experience abuse from a client, no different than if a clinician were gay and a client were blatantly homophobic and offensive and using abusive language about people in the LGBT community. So, we're not necessarily meant for every single client.
Okay, here's a good question. How is it best to discuss social justice issues with young children, particularly as a person of color working with Caucasian youth?
I think that we got to use the literature, we got to use creative arts and activities. There is a book that I just learned about, and I will tell you, it's a book for young children. Here it is. It's called Not My Idea, a book about whiteness. And it's for children ages, I believe, 6 to 8. Let me look here. It's gotten great reviews. The ages are, I'm sorry, for grades 4 through 6. And sometimes it's just as simple as talking about what's fair and what's just. Children have a strong sense of rules and structure, and we can begin to talk about how certain rules may or may not apply in certain circumstances and ask them how they feel about it and what they think about it. But I also would work with the parents because you want to find out what's being discussed in the household. What's the level of comfort in the household? You don't want to overstep or expose a child to something before the parents are ready to even be exposed to it. So I would absolutely introduce things, but I would work with the parents on it as well. We have a lot of work to do.
Okay, I know we're getting close in time, but it says, I agree that trauma is overlooked a lot when working with clients. One of the things I've tried to do in the intake when going over the trauma section is saying anything in your life that you found changed how you viewed the world or changed how you viewed people. I've found this helpful so far in my work in opening up the idea that a person may have some unresolved trauma that they didn't really think of at that time. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I like that. That's awesome. Can you say that again?
Yeah. It says, I agree that trauma is overlooked when working with clients. One of the things I've tried to do during intake when going over trauma is saying anything in your life that you have found changed how you viewed the world or changed how you viewed people.
That is awesome. That is so awesome. I hope everybody is taking note of that. I really like that. Thank you, whoever shared
There's,
that.
yep. That was Tristan.
Thank you, Tristan.
Um, and then our last question, how do you suggest white people or white therapists address white clients who may express racist points of view or use racist language or names in their therapy sessions?
Mm, that's hard. Um, Honestly, I would be brief. If you're offended, I would say you're offended and that you don't share those views, and then move right back into what you're working on with that client. However, if you're finding that some serious countertransference stuff is coming up for you and you're finding yourself unable to have compassion for that client, if they're so offensive to you that you can't have any compassion for them, then you are not doing them a service. And I really would refer anybody out that you cannot have compassion for, because that's what we're here for. That's the work we're doing. We are privileged and given the gift of people's inner world, inner life, things that they don't share with the people who they're most intimate with. And if we can't have a compassionate space for that client, then we need to move them on to someone who can. It's not our job to fix everybody. Everybody's not going to change and evolve and magically sing kumbaya with all of us. And so, we've got to be aware of our own limitations, our own biases, and where we feel we can be most effective with our clients.
Well, this has been excellent. Thank you for those answers. Those are some tough questions,
Those are
and
great questions.
definitely. Well, do you have any closing remarks or any just sort of direction that you'd like to point the viewers?
I do. As I said, this is such a mixed bag of circumstances. On the one hand, it's tragic, it's horrific. But on the other hand, for a person like me who was born in the height of the civil rights movement, so I was kind of coming of age in the 70s, 80s. For me, it's like, finally, we're dealing with this. Finally, it's being heard, it's being seen. I'm seeing protests of people of all races and with their children. That is so hopeful for me.
Hmm.
But on the other hand, it was one more tragedy, one more unnecessary lost life. It's still so ugly. It's such a mixed bag, but I think it's a great opportunity for all of us to grow and be better.
Well, I appreciate you so much, Valerie, for coming and sharing with us. And a lot of you guys have been asking questions and saying, "Can I get the slides? Can I get the slides? Can I get?" And so, yes, I will be definitely sending out the slides to everyone and a copy of this presentation itself. And you can definitely reach out to me. And then, Valerie, is there a way that people can connect with you if they'd like to do so?
Valerie@thriveworks.com.
That's right. All right. Very cool. Well, guys, I hope you have a great weekend, and we'll be in contact with you next week in terms of the safe spaces that we're going to start offering. And I hope you have a great day.
Have a great weekend, everybody.
Bye now.